Good morning and welcome to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. My name is Bill Benson. I am the host of the museum's public program, First Person. Thank you for joining us. We are in our 17th year of the First Person program, and our first person today is Mrs. Margit Meisner, whom you shall meet shortly. This 2016 season of First Person is made possible by the generosity of the Louis Franklin Smith Foundation, with additional funding from the Arlene and Daniel Fisher Foundation and the Helena Rubinstein Foundation. We are grateful for their sponsorship. First Person is a series of conversations with survivors of the Holocaust who share with us their firsthand accounts of their experience during the Holocaust. Each of our First Person guests serve as volunteers here at this museum. Our program will continue twice weekly through mid-August. The museum's website contains information about each of our upcoming First Person guests, and the address is www.ushmm.org. Anyone interested in keeping in touch with the museum and its programs can complete the Stay Connected card that's in your program, or speak with the museum representative at the back of the theater when we finish. In doing so, you will receive an electronic copy of Margit Meisner's biography so that you can remember and share her testimony after you leave here today. Margit will share her first-person account of her experience during the Holocaust for about 45 minutes. If time allows, at the end of our program, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask Margit some questions. Today's program will be live-streamed on the museum's website. This means people will be joining the program via a link from the museum's website and watching with us today from across the country and around the world. A recording of this program will be made available on the museum's website, and we invite those who are here in the auditorium today to also join us on the web when the rest of our programs in April and early May will also be live streamed. Please visit the First Person website listed on the back of your program for more details. For our web audience, if you would like to use Twitter to ask a question, send a picture, or write a comment during the program, please feel free to do so using the hashtag USHMM. The life stories of Holocaust survivors transcend the decades. What you are about to hear from Margit is one individual's account of the Holocaust. We have prepared a brief slide presentation to help with her introduction, and I'll be bringing up those slides just momentarily. Margit was born Margit Morawetz on February 26, 1922 in Innsbruck, Austria. When Margit was a baby, her family moved from Austria to Prague, Czechoslovakia. The arrow on this map, the first arrow on this map of 1933 Europe, points to Austria, and our second map points to Czechoslovakia. Prague is identified on this map of Czechoslovakia. Here we see Margit at the age of 3. She was the youngest of 4 children born to Gottlieb and Lily Morawetz. Gottlieb, seen here, was a banker from a religious Jewish family. Here we see Margit's family at the Lido, a beach resort in Venice, in 1926. From the left are her brother Felix, cousin Ernie Morawetz, her brother Bruno, her mother and father, Margit, who is circled, Margit's governess, Yeya, and her brother Paul. Margit's father, Gottlieb, passed away in 1932, when Margit was 10 years old. In 1938, when Margit was 16, attacks on Jews in Central Europe escalated, and her mother decided she should leave school in Prague. Margit was sent to Paris to live with a French family, where she studied dressmaking. In March 1939, Margit's mother joined her in France. This is Margit with her dog, Flippy, just before leaving Prague in 1938. As the Germans were advancing on Paris, Margit's mother was ordered to report to an assembly point in the south. Margit bought a bike and fled with other refugees to the south of France. Margit found out that her mother was at the Gurs detention camp in southern France, shown here in this photograph. She eventually got a train ticket to a town outside of Gurs. When France surrendered to Germany in June 1940, Margit's mother was able to leave Gurs in all the confusion and join Margit. The two fled via Spain and Portugal to the United States, where they settled in 1941. In this photo, we see Margaret in 1941, soon after she arrived in the United States. Upon her arrival in the United States, Margaret found employment as a dress finisher on Madison Avenue in New York City. From there, she attended Black Mountain College in North Carolina and married 3 days after Pearl Harbor. Margaret would later work for the Office of War Information, spend time with MGM Studios, and because of her language abilities, worked for the U.S. Army of Occupation in Germany, re-educating Hitler Youth. We can't do justice today to describing the remarkable journey her life took from there, but it included many stops in the U.S. and abroad. Margaret would eventually spend 20 years with the Montgomery County, Maryland public school system, specializing in disability issues. She remains on the board of an organization which she helped found 27 years ago that helps youth with disabilities obtain employment after graduation from high school. Margaret lives in Bethesda, Maryland. She has 2 children and 2 grandchildren. Her daughter Anne lives nearby in Silver Spring, Maryland, and Margaret's son Paul is a hospital planner at Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx. Since Margaret's partner Irving passed away in 2008 at the age of 97, Margaret's friend and now husband John takes very good care of her. Margaret leads tours in all 3 of the museum's exhibits and speaks in various settings about her Holocaust experience. Recently, she spoke in Congress to call attention to the Syrian refugee crisis. Margaret also works in the museum's archives, translating documents from Czech and German to English. In 2003, Margaret's autobiography, Margaret's Story, was published. Immediately after today's program, Margaret will be available to sign copies of her autobiography, which is also available in the museum's bookstore. And with that, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming our first person, Mrs. Margaret Meisner.
Such an impressive.
You have an amazing big crowd. Margaret, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for being willing to be our first person. And we have an amazing crowd for our first day of live streaming over the internet, so you're our first person for us to do that with. We have so much for you to tell us about in a short time, so we'll start right away. Although you were born in Austria and your family moved to Prague, Czechoslovakia when you were very young, you lived there until 1938 when your mother sent you to Paris at age 16. Let's begin our conversation today with you telling us, Margaret, about your family, your community, and yourself in those years before you went to Paris when your life would change forever.
Well, I was the youngest of 4 children, as you saw in this picture, and we were a very, very well-to-do family that was very intent on keeping up the keeping up the decor in which we lived. And as the youngest of 4 children and the only girl, I was always considered a little doll, and I did not like that. They just wanted to hug me and really sort of play with me, and I thought it was not a good idea to be a girl and to be so young. Of course, now I don't have this problem anymore.
Margaret, tell us about your brothers.
So I had 3 brothers, as you saw also on the photograph. And the interesting thing about them is that each one eventually settled on a different continent. So my oldest brother, Paul, found refuge when Hitler entered Czechoslovakia in Australia. My second brother, Felix, had come to the United States before the beginning of the war. And my third brother, Bruno, became a Canadian, and I became an American. So that was really due to the fact that nobody in the world wanted to give asylum to penniless refugees, and we just had to find it wherever we could.
Margaret, you lost your father early. Do you remember much about him?
Well, unfortunately, I don't remember much about him at all, because in the kind of world that I lived, children were the work of the mother, and I primarily had a governess who really brought me up. So my father was a very distant figure, but I knew that he was an important man, and then that one had to respect him.
After your father died, you told me that you were put under a guardian. What did that mean to you and your mother?
Well, my father, I think, didn't believe that his wife, my mother, was able to handle finances, because in that world, women were not expected to know anything about money. So when my father passed away, and in his will, he decided to leave his assets to a guardian. So although we were a well-to-do family, my mother did not have very much money with which to run the rather complicated household.
In 1938, after Hitler annexed Austria, your mother and you made a momentous decision to send you from Prague to live in Paris. Tell us what convinced you and your mother to make that decision, why you chose Paris, and what your life was like once you were there.
Well, it was a momentous decision, certainly, but in the environment in which we lived, where there were no media and we had really no idea what was going on in the world, it didn't seem so momentous. I was in 10th grade. I was a good student that passed the tests. I was not interested in school because I was interested in boys. And when my mother said, "You should leave here," I thought that was a good idea. I was proud that mother had confidence in me at age 16, that I could take care of myself in a foreign country. And I knew French because we had had a French governess at home, so the language was not a problem. And when I was going to go to Paris to study dressmaking. Now, why dressmaking? You have to understand that in 1932, if you wanted the dress, you didn't go to the department store. You went to the dressmaker. So dressmaking, sewing, was a very respectable profession. And I thought the idea, because we knew that the Jews lost all their assets if they wanted to emigrate from Germany. So if we lost everything, then I would have to be able to make a living someplace. And the someplace was very unknown, with a language that I might not know. So if I had a profession like a lawyer or a doctor, I would need to know the language, but as a dressmaker, I could make my way in any country.
When you were in Czechoslovakia before going to Paris, you were at all times an Austrian citizen. What significance was that?
Well, the significance of that at the time, when I was little, it didn't make any difference. When Austria was annexed in 1938, that became a very important point. And I think if I hadn't been an Austrian citizen, if I had been a Czech citizen, my mother wouldn't have felt as frightened. But because Austria was no part of Germany, and because the anti-Semitic laws in Germany were very threatening, so she thought I should get out of that environment. When we came to France, it started to make a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. And we'll hear more about that in a few minutes. Did you or your mother know the family that you went to in Paris?
No, mother found this family who was willing to take me in, and it was a very good choice. They were lovely people, and they were young people my age who took me in right away, and it really was not a difficult transition. I think for most refugees who had to leave their home, it was a very traumatic decision, but I was not the father of a family who had a standing in the community. I had no standing anywhere. I had not left anything behind. So for me to leave was rather an excursion. And I had no idea that I would never see my Prague again, that I would never see my friends. That was totally unpredictable.
And at that time, was your mother able to travel to see you in Paris?
No, at first she wasn't. But then she decided to come and see me. And during that time, all of Czechoslovakia was annexed. So basically, she had left Prague as though she had gone on vacation. And when she was in France and she was not able to go back, all that remained of all our possessions was a little suitcase with which she came. Mm-hmm. And from one day to the next, we really became penniless, which was a huge issue, because until then, Mother had been able to send me a certain amount of money every month to pay for my expenses, and now that was all gone.
Mm-hmm. Before we turn to what life was like for you in Paris and then in France, you mentioned Hitler annexed Czechoslovakia. That meant essentially that he took control of Czechoslovakia, and this was before the war began.
Correct. So that was in March of 1939, and it was a huge disappointment to Czechoslovakia, because Austria was interested in being part of Germany, but the Czechs were really enemies of the Germans, and they felt that the world had abandoned them because the French and the British made a pact with Hitler to hand over parts of Czechoslovakia without consulting the Czech government. And so this was famous appeasement at Munich, which nowadays sometimes you hear mentioned when there are discussion about our dealings with Iran. They say this is going to be another Munich, which means we are going to be sold out again.
So, Margaret, as you were beginning to tell us, your mother did come to Paris. So once there, you lived together for a while. What was your life like together, and what did you face?
We had very little money, so we lived in a rented room. And I went to dressmaking school very happily. It was fun. I was, at the beginning, I was a very bad student, but then I caught up with the rest, and I think I became quite a competent pattern maker and dressmaker. And then one day, then of course, so the World War II started in September of 1939, and because I was, Austria was part of Germany, France was at war with Germany, I became an enemy alien. And that became very uncomfortable because the French in general didn't want to have refugees there, and certainly they didn't need any ex-Autrichiens, which meant the former Austrians who were now Germans.
Mm-hmm. Did your mother and you have the same status?
Well, it turned out that we didn't, because when war came close to France, my mother was not permitted to live in Paris, where we had this rented room. So she had to move to the countryside a few miles out. And there, one day, as the war was approaching, she received notice to present herself at the police station with 3 days' worth of food, whatever she could carry on her back, and 2 blankets, and she would be evacuated, which basically was the buzzword for being deported.
For being deported.
And I took her to the station, to this bus station, and when I asked the people, why are you deporting her, and where are you taking her, they said, none of your business, go home. So just in the very last minute before Mother boarded her bus, she she took out of her pocket a significant amount of money, which I didn't know she had, and she gave it to me with these words: "It's now up to you to get us out of here." Now, I never found out what that meant, but it certainly meant that I had to get busy to find her, to get her out wherever she was, and to get both of us out away from the approaching German army.
And of course, the German army did approach in June of 1940 when they attacked France. You're separated from your mother, and you were forced to flee Paris. What did you do? Tell us about that.
In despair, because I didn't have any friends in France. Most of my friends were from Czechoslovakia. They were not enemy aliens, and they were able to leave without any problem. I had to go to the police every other day to show my face, and they always said, if you do anything illegal, we will immediately arrest you. And of course, I was very threatened. And the crowds were streaming out of Paris away from the Nazi onslaught. And so I went to the police station to get permission to leave. And when I got to the police station was open, the policeman had fled, so there was nobody there. So I couldn't get permission, but I had an alibi that I thought I at least had tried to get permission. And in my despair, when I saw all these crowds walking, I decided to take the money that Mother had given me and bought myself a bicycle. And I found the only bicycle that was available in Paris, I think, on that day. And it had men's racing bike handles, these kind of handles. I was not a good bicyclist, but I just knew how to ride a bicycle. So I bought that bicycle, and I had with me a little case for the back of the bicycle, which contained a set of underwear, a pain au chocolat, a chocolate croissant, and my dressmaking notes, because now that would be important. And then I had a case of oil paints, because as a dress designer, I had to be an artist, so it was important that I had these oil paints. Now, when I think about it today, it just seems absurd.
And that was the sum total of what you had with you when you decided to flee Paris on this bike.
Absolutely.
And I'm going to go back a little bit right before that. You were out on the streets of Paris. You were telling me you saw everybody around, their faces were covered in black.
Yeah, well, that was a sign that the German army was approaching, because the day before, when I went to the police station to get permission, I saw the people in Paris with black faces, and I couldn't imagine what had happened. And then when I came home, I had the same black face. So it seemed that the French army had put a smoke screen across the River Seine to be able to evacuate the French troops across the river before the Germans approached. So that was a sign that the Germans were really at the gates of Paris and that I had to leave. But it was very frightening because there were streams and streams of people all going in one direction, which I assumed was going south. And they didn't have many belongings, and people drove cars that they didn't know how to drive and that got stuck. It was a tremendously chaotic situation.
And literally thousands and thousands and thousands of Parisians on the road, and there you are on your bike with your little provisions.
All by myself, always wondering, where am I going? Why am I going? Am I doing the right thing?
Did you have an idea where you wanted to go?
Well, I had wanted to go to the northwest of France, because they are the only friends that I had in Paris that were also Austrians. They also fled, and we said we would meet in Brest, which is on the northwest corner of France, near England. But as I was going on my bicycle, I was just riding. I didn't know where I was going. I wasn't tired. I was not hungry. I just kept bicycling.
You shared with me that at first on the bicycle you were upset about being on a bicycle, I think because young women your age weren't on bicycles.
Of course, I was continuously conflicted about not only whether it's the right decision, but whether a young lady in my situation could really do something that unusual, whether it was proper. Everything in my life had to be, quote, proper, because that is the kind of world that I grew up in. And if you remember, the first picture that you saw on the screen here was of me as a little girl with white socks. Well, these white socks were really important because I went to the park with my governess with white socks, and the big issue was that I shouldn't step in anything and make my white socks dirty. So a proper little girl could walk in proper white socks. So that concept continued throughout my adolescence.
So here you are on this bike, riding all day with thousands of people. What happened at the end of that first day?
At the end of that first day, a policeman motioned to me as it was getting dark and said, "Come close." Now, of course, I was sure he was going to ask me for my papers. I didn't have the proper papers, and he was going to arrest me. But he said, "Mademoiselle, take your bicycle. You can spend the night in the school in the next block, and you can lie down on the classroom floor and spend the night." So I took my bicycle and went to the school, and when I lay down there, it occurred to me that I had a letter in my pocket, a letter which I had received just before I left the house and hadn't looked at, because I didn't recognize the handwriting. And I looked at the letter, and it was from somebody who my mother had been able to tell that she was in a concentration camp, in a French camp called Gurs. Now, nobody had ever heard of Gurs, but I knew that it said it was close to the Pyrenees at the French-Spanish border. So at least I had an idea where Gurs was and where I could maybe find my mother.
That was day one. What happened on day two?
Well, then on day two, I continued riding. Now I had a destination, although it was not the destination that I had originally thought, because I was going west and now I was going south.
Now you're going to Gurs.
To Gurs. And so I continued riding, and I fell off my bike. I collided with another woman, and we both looked at the bike, looked at the damage of the bike. It wasn't severely enough damage that I couldn't continue riding. So I continued riding. And a few minutes later, a young man approaches me. And of course, I got frightened. What does a young man want from me? And he said, "Mademoiselle, mademoiselle, you can't continue riding. You are going to lose too much blood." And he pointed to my leg. And indeed, I had a very deep gash in my leg that was bleeding heavily, but I didn't realize it. I just kept on going. I didn't look. Now that he told me that I had a gash in my leg, now it started hurting. And he also said, "There is a drugstore not far from here. Go there and see whether you can have the leg bandaged." And so I went to the drugstore, and the druggist looked at it and said, "You have to go to the hospital, it has to be sewn up." I said, "I can't go to the hospital, I have no papers, just bandage it." And then he said to me, "Why are you riding a bicycle?" I said, "Because there are no trains in France." The reality was there were no trains in Paris, but further south there were trains. So he said, "Go to Orléans, to the train station." So with a bandaged leg, I went to Orléans, and there was another chaotic situation where hundreds and hundreds of people were waiting for trains to arrive. And it was really chaos with women fainting and children crying and old women sitting there whimpering. It was really a very chaotic situation. And in the middle of that, after I had waited several hours to approach the window, there was an air raid alarm. And everybody to the basement. And I viewed the situation and decided I wasn't going to the basement. And I stayed up on top, and I watched the bombs coming out on both sides of the railway station. And fortunately, they did not catch us. What I didn't know at the time was that the school where I had spent the night, a few hours after I left, because I left at daybreak, the school was bombed to smithereens, and I wasn't there anymore. So I was very, very lucky.
In fact, your decision to not go to the bomb shelter at the train station meant you were at the front of the line when the air raid was over, and you were able to get a ticket.
Correct. I was able to get my ticket. I was able to register my bicycle, but I never got it again.
So where did you go from there?
Well, then, instead of going to the west, the train that I was in was going south. And when I got out, it turned out I was in a town where I had friends near the Pyrenees. And when I told my friends where my mother was, they said, this is 12 kilometers from Gurs. So this was an incredibly lucky coincidence. So the lady who took me in went to the camp to see whether she could find my mother, but she couldn't find my mother. And this was the day before France capitulated, so there was basically no more government working. And she came back and said, I couldn't find your mom. I left a message. She's most likely not going to get it, so I don't know what we're going to do. So I didn't expect her. And that France had capitulated, and I was sitting in Salis de Béarn, not knowing what to do. And one day I was sitting in the yard, and from far away a woman comes up and waves at me. And I didn't wave back. I didn't know anybody who could wave at me. And she came closer and closer, and she kept waving more energetically. And I still didn't respond. And when she came real close, it was my mom. And so she was so thrilled to have found her child, because she didn't know where I could be. She had no idea that I had bought a bicycle and tried to leave. She was afraid I was in Paris. And I was so stunned to see her that I didn't even run to embrace her. And the one thing she said about her concentration camp experience, because she never talked about it, but the one thing she said, here I found my child, and she wasn't even coming to welcome me.
Before we continue from there, Margaret, I want to ask you a couple of questions. When you finally got off the train ride, and into this little town, what did you do when you got into that little town? And one of the things I want you to share is that you ended up being taken to the police station.
So I knew that I had friends. I went to my friend's house, and they were very welcoming, but I couldn't stay there. They said, because there wasn't room. But they knew of a peasant woman who lived on the other side of the square, where there would be, where I could maybe find a place. And so I went there. It was 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I had not slept yet, and I don't know whether I had eaten anything. I don't remember that. But so the lady took me in and showed me that mansard room up under the roof, and I lay down, finally sort of thinking, now I could relax. And a few minutes later, I don't know how much later, all of a sudden, there's a knock at the door, and 2 policemen come in. And the lady, the peasant lady who had taken me in, obviously thought there was something strange about me, and she alerted the police that I had come. And these 2 policemen took me by the arm and said, "We'll take you to the police station." And of course, I was totally stunned. And there was, in this town, there's this big, huge cobblestone square, and 2 policemen walking next to me, and I thought the end of the world had arrived, and I started to cry. And then they took me to the police station, and the police chief took one look at me and said to these eager policemen, "Let her go." So that was a great thing, because he realized that I wasn't the spy they were afraid of. So that was before my mother came. I had that experience. And of course, it was a very frightening experience, because I was nowhere. I didn't know what was going to happen, and it was such a chaotic time for everybody, because the government had just fallen and no new government was in place.
When your mother did arrive, she'd been in this camp that people didn't know about, Gurs, but it was notorious. What kind of condition was your mother in?
I really don't know very much about it, except that she spent most of her time outdoors because she was so sunburned. That's one of the reasons why I didn't recognize her. She had lost so much weight, and she was so sunburned. I think that was a reason why I didn't recognize her. But she said it was an unbelievable experience, and she really didn't talk about it. But much later, when she was at our house when my children were little, when my children made a fuss about eating, they always said, "You should have been in Gurs. You would eat whatever is put in front of you." She tried to. That was the one thing she kept saying about Gurs, that they really didn't have enough food.
And as you told us, Margit, the French government had now capitulated to the Germans. You were in what's known as the occupied zone.
The occupied zone. So now we had to get out of the occupied zone into the unoccupied zone if we wanted to leave. Of course we wanted to leave. Everybody wanted to get out of the war zone. And we again had, so we didn't have permission to leave. Mother, of course, had no papers, and I did not have the right kind of papers. So we left our belongings. I still had the little box on the back of my car, and Mother had the backpack with which she was arrested. And we gave that to a farmer with a wagon to take it to the other side of to the unoccupied zone of France, and we walked out of the occupied zone as though we were just taking a walk. Mm-hmm. And there was no border there, but people knew where the border was. So it was all, and it was, every step was frightening, because we didn't know whether they would find us, whether they could see us, what they would do with us. It was it seemed like a very simple activity that was very stressful.
Is that when you fell in with a group of Lutheran pastors?
Yeah, that was another tremendous coincidence. So we found an abandoned house on the other side of the divide. It was an abandoned house that had a roof. It had windows that were cracked, and it had some bedsteads. And so we decided that was better than nothing, so we installed ourselves there. And can't remember what we ate, but we must have eaten some of the vegetables that were around. And a couple of days later, a few gentlemen who were properly dressed, who didn't seem to be refugees, came to this house. And when we started talking to them, it turned out that they were from Czechoslovakia. Imagine the coincidence. And they were pastors in the Lutheran Church, and they were also fleeing from the Germans, and they were going to Marseille on the coast, on the Mediterranean coast of France, from where they hoped they were going to be able to leave Europe. And they said to us, you can't stay here, you also have to go to Marseille. Would have never occurred to us to go to Marseille if it hadn't been for these pastors. So again, tremendously lucky and coincidence. And so indeed, we then tried to follow them, but our trip was very eventful because we always tried to avoid the police that were searching the train. So when we saw the police coming, then we tried to get off the train, go back on in a car in which they had been so that they would not find us. And when we got to the police station to the railroad station in Marseille, they were checking papers, and of course we didn't have papers, so we waited until everybody was gone and the police was gone and they weren't looking anymore, and so that's how we got into Marseille.
And once you were in Marseille, from there, you wanted to get out of Marseille and get out of France, and you and your mother's determination to escape the Nazis and to flee Europe would then take you on a journey over the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain and eventually to Portugal. How did you do that?
So, my mother was completely passive. This very, very courageous, energetic lady didn't want to do anything. She said to me, if we are going to leave here, it's going to be up to you to do it, because don't expect me to do anything.
Was she just worn out at that stage?
Well, she was shocked by the experience. Okay. And she just didn't want to have any responsibility and make any decisions. So I became very active. It was really role reversal. I became the mother and she was the child. And I found us, through circuitous ways, a Spanish and Portuguese transit visa, which meant that we could go through Spain and Portugal to wherever else. And the French would not give people like us exit permits. They didn't want us there, but for some reason they had promised the Germans that they would hand over all the Jews, so they didn't want to give us exit permits.
So just so we understand, you had transit visas that would allow you to travel, but the French wouldn't give you an exit visa to allow you to use the transit visas.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the exit visas were good. These transit visas were good for a month. And the month went by and we couldn't get a French exit permit. So the last day of the validity of the visa, we met a gentleman in the street whom we barely knew, and he said, yesterday they let people like you cross the border, go to the border. Now, to take that advice from somebody we hardly knew was really not a very, very smart thing to do, but we did it. And we came to the border, and everybody had to get off the train because they had to go onto a different train, and everybody left, and we were left behind because the border police said, you can't leave, you don't have an exit permit, go back. So it seemed again that the end of the world had arrived. But there was a porter there to whom I confided our problem, and he said, well, maybe I can help you. Maybe I can show you how you can walk across the border. Walk up on the French side and down on the Spanish side. And I said, okay, how do we do that? And he explained the way to me very carefully. And so I said to Mother, let's go. And it was really, if you think about it, was a lovely excursion because the weather was good and it was, the countryside was beautiful, except we were, of course, tremendously scared and stressed. But we walked, and I knew exactly where I was supposed to go, but we lost our way.
Because the Pyrenees have peaks as high as 11,000 feet.
Yes, but it was not that high. But we lost our way and got caught by the Spanish police, because although we had a valid visa, we had crossed the border at an unauthorized border crossing point. So they took us in, and this was a small border railroad station, took us to the railroad station, and then decided they were going to take us to the next town where there was a police station to arraign us. And I remember sitting at this little railroad station with 2 policemen at either side and my mother on the other side, and thinking, that's the end.
After all you've been through, this is the end.
So we went to the police station, and there was at night by then, and there were lots of other refugees at that police station. It was again very, very chaotic, but not as chaotic as the railroad station in France. And they had taken all our belongings, my box and my mother's backpack, so we had nothing. And there was a French-speaking policeman whom I approached and said, look, nothing is going to happen here until tomorrow morning when the police station opens. Why couldn't we go someplace and spend the night? And a few minutes later, he came back to me and said, follow me. So I thought he was taking us to some place where we were going to spend the night. Indeed, he did. But that place turned out to be a prison. So now we were in a Spanish prison that was part of the Franco-fascist regime that was that was a very scary place. And the only other people who were in jail at that time were teachers, because the Frankists didn't think that the teachers would ever be democratic. And the other group that was in the prison were prostitutes, because prostitution was forbidden. And so we were in a huge hall where there were probably 60 beds, and the beds were about this size, a half a yard, with a straw mat on some kind of straw on the iron springs, and that was the bed for Mother and me. And so the light was not turned off. It was very bright, and this was right next to the latrines, and the stench was really awful. And in the morning, we came to the police chief, who looked at us and said, so you are ex-Austrians, which means you're German. So we will inform the German authorities in Spain, and they will come and take you over. So all this whole trek that I just described, we did in order to avoid the Germans, and then we were going to be turned over to the Germans in Spain. But you see, fortunately, I am here.
So how did you manage that?
Well, another complicated story. That's why I wrote this book.
In the little time we have left, and we want to ask our audience to ask you some questions, but you managed to get out of that, and the book tells us how, and you made it to Portugal.
Made it to Portugal, and there I became a dressmaker. So the idea that I would become a dressmaker without having to know the language was correct, because here I was in Portugal. I didn't know the language, but there were lots of refugees now from Czechoslovakia that had also lost all their clothing, so nobody had anything to wear, and they were delighted that they had a dressmaker to whom they could speak in their language. So that was very fortunate. And I became the dressmaker to the refugees. And I had to learn Portuguese very fast, because I had to go to the market, and I had to go buy notions and fabric, and that was a very, very fast learning experience. And I had a very good time in Portugal, mainly because I was not a young Portuguese girl. Portuguese young women of a certain class were never permitted to walk in the street by themselves, because it wasn't proper. They had to have an escort, a brother or a parent or so. And I was not a Portuguese girl, so I could walk in the streets freely, and the Portuguese young men all were impressed that there was a young girl who was walking alone. So they would start talking to me, and if I liked the way they looked, then I talked to them, and if I didn't like them, I said, I don't speak Portuguese. And in the very end, so then I made friends with a couple of Portuguese young men who then, the day before we left for the United States, took me to a resort area to show me parts of Portugal. Of course, we had no money, no time to be tourists. We just had to survive there. But it was very ego-supporting to always be accosted by young men, whether I liked them or not.
Margaret, Portugal was a neutral country, so it was a safe harbor for you. But from there, you made it to the United States. You came to the U.S. on a ship.
Yeah, so really quite remarkably and unexpectedly, we were able to get an American immigration visa. And then there were no boats to be had because there was war and there were submarines in the Atlantic Ocean. So in the end, the only boat that we could find was a Portuguese cork freighter.
Cork freighter.
Corks for bottle corks. And that took about 2 weeks, and there were about 5 other people on the ship, and I was seasick continuously because the boat was very light. And if I wasn't seasick, I used to play ping pong with the crew. And so I became a very good ping pong player, and I also learned a lot of Portuguese talking to the crew on the ship. But when we came to the United States, one of my brothers, who had been here before, came to pick us up. Of course, we did not arrive and see the Statue of Liberty because we arrived in a small port on the Chesapeake Bay.
And here you are today.
Yes, very lucky. Almost. Thank you.
We obviously, we could spend hours and hours and hours here with Margaret, and I wish we could do that, but we aren't going to do that today. But we have time for a few questions, and we're going to start first with taking questions from our web audience on Twitter. Then we will turn to our live audience here in the auditorium to see if you have any questions. But let's take that first question that we have online, and I think it's back there. So Carolyn O'Neill asks, Margaret, why do you think regimes continue to target their own people like those in Rwanda and Syria? How is this still possible 70 years after the Holocaust?
Well, this is a very important question because I think as a Holocaust survivor, I would have never expected that such a thing could happen again. I very naively thought that if one had seen Hitler and the persecution of the Jews on television, the world would not have permitted it. But so I was very naive, and unfortunately I was wrong. And regimes still persecute their own people for religious or for political reasons, and they are as vicious as the Germans were against the Nazis. And I think that the Syrian refugee crisis is an enormous crisis. There are millions of people who are displaced inside Syria and millions who are trying to seek refuge abroad, and the world is not really interested in helping them, or in helping them well enough, and in understanding how to deal with this crisis. So it's a major issue, and I have been speaking about it at the sort of what Holocaust survivors feel when they see these many refugees who have no place to go.
Thank you, Margaret. I think we do have time for a couple questions from our audience here in the auditorium, and I see a hand here. We're going to ask you to come to the microphone if you don't mind, just because it's so big and that way everybody can hear it. Try to make your question brief if you can, and then I will repeat it as best I can just to make sure everybody, including Margaret, hears your question. So, yes, sir.
Hey. How do you feel that any of the remaining Nazis today should be punished or not?
What was the question?
How do you feel about any remaining Nazis today and whether they should be punished? Okay. Or not. Okay.
Well, I think most of the perpetrators of the Holocaust are not alive anymore, because they are, really most of them are dead. I really do not feel any animosity towards Germany, because the present generation Germans really had no responsibility for what happened. The Germans were responsible for having a government like Hitler and for letting that government persecute Jews, because they were not watching what the government was doing. They were just letting it happen. They were not anti-Semitic, maybe themselves, but they were also not willing to be active and do anything against the Nazis.
To stand up and take a stance.
Right.
Thank you very much. Do we have another question? We have, I think, a young man here and then a young woman there in the middle. Can you go to the microphone? Okay, you're getting up and going first. You're like Margaret walking on the road by herself. Yeah.
So, what are your thoughts of Hitler?
What are your thoughts of Hitler? Well, what are your thoughts about Hitler after all this time?
I think Hitler was a deranged man who was very clever and very charismatic, and he was able to persuade a large group of Germans to follow his way of thinking. I am a person who is not interested in vengeance. I don't believe that that gets you anywhere. So I think perpetrators should be punished, but one should not ascribe responsibility to basically innocent people who stood by. So I wish that he hadn't existed.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question, and I see this, you had your hand up. Now you're standing up. There you go. All right. I'm going to also say that Margaret is going to stay after she concludes the program in a few moments. Margaret is going to stay up here on the stage. Oh, no, you're not. You've got to go sign your book. That's right. So that might be an opportunity to also ask Margaret some questions. So yes, we have a young man here.
How did you feel? How do you feel when your mother went on the bus and you didn't know where she was going?
How did you say that one more time for us?
Yeah. How do you feel when you? How do you feel when your mother went? How did you feel when your mother went on the bus, when she went away? That's a very good question, because I felt terrified. I didn't know where she was going, and you have to understand that one didn't know what was going on in the world. And there was no information, and there was no way for me to get any information. So I was pretty terrified. On the other hand, she said to me, it's up to you to get us out of here. So I couldn't just be terrified. I had to do something. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I went back home and I thought, now what am I going to do? And so I think that helped me overcome the terror I felt. But it was a very tough moment, and I have to congratulate you that you caught that. That was very perceptive of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for being here. Remind you that we'll do first-person programs each Wednesday and Thursday until the middle of August. For April and May, we'll be live streaming them over the internet, so you can watch them that way. They're going to be archived. You can look at them later, so a lot of opportunities to see our first-person program. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person has the last word. So I'm going to turn to Margaret now to close our program, and then as soon as she's done, we want her to make her way up the stairs so that she can get up to where she will be signing copies of her autobiography, Margaret's Story. And as you can see, there's a lot of details that we were not able to hear today that I think all of us would want to hear about.
Well, I think the important thing that I have to leave you with is that you should not be a bystander when you see injustice in your own communities, when you see bullying, when you see scapegoating, prejudice against people who may be different. Don't just stand by and say, I'm just a little person, I can't do anything. That's not right. I think what each individual does really does matter. And the museum's logo is what you do matters, and I really believe that. And I try to live that way because I think that I continue working here because I would like to tell people like you all that how important it is that you should be informed about what goes on in the world and in your community, and that you should be active and see whether you can make the world, a better place where violence is not used as a means of settling problems. So I'd like you to remember that.